When people first started asking me to talk about making a case for Christianity, I kind of thought, well, I don't even know why they would come to me as a detective. I can see why I could make a case, but what is the similarity between the cases I work and the Scripture, for example, the Bible? Here's my casebook, and here's my Bible. What's the similarity here between these two things? Well, it turns out if you think about it, there are some similarities between cold cases and working the case for Christianity. My cold cases are pretty rough. They're old, and most of my witnesses are no longer alive. My witnesses died years ago, and they were interviewed by a detective perhaps, and guess what? Sometimes that detective has passed away in the years since as well. So now I don't have the original witness available to me, and even the person who wrote the supplemental report about what that witness said, that guy's not even available to me. What does that sound like to you? It kind of sounds like the Gospels, doesn't it? I can't even make my cases on the basis of like forensic evidence. That's why they went cold when they did. There wasn't really any good evidence to make the case with. I don't have cases that I've solved with DNA or with fingerprint evidence or with other forms of forensic evidence. Those aren't the nature of my cold cases. I make my cases on the basis of cumulative circumstantial cases. Cumulative circumstantial collections of evidence. What I mean is indirect evidence, not direct eyewitness testimony, indirect pieces of evidence that point to the same reasonable inference. Now think about this for a second. That's the nature of my cold cases. But that's really very similar to the nature of the case for Christianity. You're not going to have access to your eyewitnesses. You're not even going to have access to the people who wrote those reports. And you don't have forensic evidence you can test, DNA, fingerprints, those kinds of things. You have to build the case on the basis of a large body of evidence, indirect evidence, because it's not eyewitnesses, and you're just trying to assemble what is the most reasonable inference from all of this evidence. So it turns out the process that we use as cold case detectives could actually be applied to studying the Scripture. So what I want to do is take a few steps with you to help you understand some of the important practices, investigative practices of detectives that we use to make the case for any criminal case, and show you how these same practices can be used to make the case, to investigate the case for Christianity. Now, one of the first practices you're going to have to wrap your hands around is simply this. You have to take the time to read your casebook anytime you open a new case. And that's why I brought for you this particular casebook. This is a casebook from an old murder. It's about 30 years old. And this is what we start with. This thing would typically be on a shelf, unsolved. And I have a first duty here, which is to open this casebook and go through every single page of this case. And there's just report after report that I have to read. It's tempting to shortcut it. Okay, this is kind of similar to that. No, can't do that. Have to actually go through it piece by piece, word by word. Because if you don't do that, you will sometimes get an idea that seems powerful, but you're taking it out of context. You're not actually even getting it in the proper context because you didn't take the time to read this thing from cover to cover. You've got to read it from cover to cover to keep it in proper context. The same thing happens though in Scripture, right? If I was to read a simple passage and take it out, I can find a way to twist that for my own purposes. I've given an example in Forensic Faith, the book, from Psalm 56. And it's an example that I could see a young woman taking and actually applying to herself, when in fact, in its context, it's not been written for young women to apply to themselves. In Psalm 56, you'll find a passage in which it is written, "Be merciful to me, O God, for men hotly pursue me." Could you imagine if I was to take that, or a young woman was to take that out of context and apply that to herself as her life verse? I don't think that would probably be appropriate, given that the entire context of verse of Psalm 56 is actually intended to be read as a statement from David. Look at how David actually uses this in its proper context. He says, "Be merciful to me, O God, for men hotly pursue me. All day long they press their attack. My slanderers pursue me all day long. Many are attacking me in their pride. When I am afraid, I will trust in you." Do you get a sense that in its context, that's a very different verse and probably should not be excerpted and used by young women to make a case for their own being pursued by young men? So I think this is why it's so important for us to read everything cover to cover. And if we're in a book or a verse set, we have to read it in the entire context and not excerpt one verse by itself. The next thing we have to do is, as we're reading this book, we have to keep in mind the broad principles of evidence, right? I mean, we have to kind of understand how we work evidence, and I've discussed some of this in the book, Forensic Faith. But what I want to talk about here is one of the most important broad principles, and I hear this as an objection all the time. And that is, Jim, you're proposing that there is an extraordinary claim you're making here, that there is a God, or that Christianity is true, or that a man could rise from the dead after being crucified. That's an extraordinary claim. If you want me to believe an extraordinary claim, you're going to have some extraordinary evidence. Okay, that seems on its face rhetorically powerful, doesn't it? And it almost seems reasonable that if I've got an extraordinary claim, I have to have extraordinary evidence to back it up. But I can tell you, I've worked cases, this was one, in which the crime was so rare that I couldn't even find another similar crime in my state, in the history of the state. So for all the citizens who live in my state, very few commit murders. So they're rare to begin with. But of all the murders that have ever been occurred, I could not find a single one that was like this one. I had an extraordinary set of claims. Did I need extraordinary evidence in order to make the case? No. As a matter of fact, my evidence was really quite pedestrian, the same kind of evidence I use in every other case. And I was able to convict a man of an extraordinary crime, an extraordinary claim, with really very ordinary evidence. You don't need extraordinary evidence to prove something extraordinary. You have to simply understand the role of evidence and the kinds of evidence that we do use when we make a claim. So I just want to help you at least overcome that first objection. You might think, wow, I'm not quite even sure what kind of extraordinary evidence I could use. It turns out it'll be rather ordinary evidence. The same kind of evidence we use in criminal cases, we will use right here. And how are we going to learn that evidence? How are we going to discover that evidence? We're going to do that by employing investigative practice number 3. I want you to become really good note takers, really good analysts of the case in general. I brought the Bible that I purchased when I first became a believer. I was not willing to invest much in this investigation at first. I didn't think Christianity was true. And the first pastor I encountered who got me interested in Christianity simply pitched Jesus as a really smart guy. So I thought, okay, fine, I'll buy a Bible to see how smart Jesus is. So I bought this one. I think I spent about $6 for this. This is a pew Bible. Very, very, it's the kind of thing you see under a church chair or a pew. And I started to go through it. But I already had a discipline in place. I was a pretty good note taker and a pretty good analyst of the kinds of words we use. As a matter of fact, I had mastered something, not mastered, but I had become pretty good at something called forensic statement analysis. It's really more of an art than a science, but it's really a discipline of studying word choices that suspects might make when writing down what they were doing on the day of a crime. Give me that piece of paper. I want to study your statement to see where it is you're lying to me, where it is you're leaving something out. And we do that by examining the words that are optional. Optional words. It turns out that's the giveaway. The words you don't have to use, but you do, optionally, those are what I'm looking at. So for example, and I made a list of these in Forensic Faith, I'm looking at things like pronoun use. That's really important. I could call somebody by their first name. I could say, he did this. What kind of pronoun I use to describe somebody tells me a lot about how I feel about that person. I applied that to Scripture. As a matter of fact, if you look at my first Bible, you will see that it is a colored mess of all kinds of notes on no matter where I open it, you'll see it basically looks the same. Because I was using forensic statement analysis to dive into the material in Scripture, looking to see how does Paul describe his fellow disciples, his fellow apostles? How does he describe them? It was important to me to see what kind of pronoun use he was going to use, because it would tell me something about how he really felt about them. Also, there are other optional words. Let me give you an example. Anytime you've ever used an adjective or an adverb, that's a word you didn't need to use. I could say, these are my brown glasses. I could say, these are my really cool plastic brown glasses. I didn't have to say the cool brown plastic part. But my additional choice of optional words will tell you something about what I believe about my glasses, and maybe even something about me. So I'm also looking through Scripture and through my case books at the kinds of adjectives that people use. What kinds of optional words do they use? It tells me something. Another thing I'm looking for is how a suspect will expand or contract time. In other words, if you're describing 4 hours of activity, what will you skip? What will you include? It'll tell me something about either what you think is important in those 4 hours or what you don't want me to know about in those 4 hours. So expansion and contraction of time is something you can also look at in Scripture. If I've got a gospel account, I can look and see why some gospel authors will stop at this event and take time to expand it, and other authors don't. It might tell me if that author is getting that information from somebody else or was maybe there to see it for himself. These are things you can actually analyze in Scripture using the same tool you used over here. The other thing I'm looking for is apparent illogical or contradictory information. And suspects, for example, this is often common because they're lying to me about something and they'll get stuck in a nonsensical statement or an illogical statement. I was looking and expecting to find lots of those in Scripture because I didn't think it was true. When I didn't find those, it started to shake me because I was a committed atheist and I was a committed philosophical naturalist. I suspected all these miracles could not be true. And it was when I didn't find the illogical or the sensical inconsistencies that I thought I would find, I was like, this is starting to look reasonable. And that, for me, was the first step from skepticism toward a forensic faith.